I'm not gonna disable the room, so.
Yeah. I'll grab another chair for Gabriela.
I thought there were only 2 speakers.
There's a moderator, Gabriela.
Is she not gonna stand at the podium?
She'll do the introduction there, but when she moderates, she might sit.
Well, then I have to disable the room. And now no one can have PowerPoints.
Sorry, I emailed Miguel that she was going to be introducing and also moderating, but he may have only got the introduction part.
Well, it depends on one's style. A lot of people moderate from...
Standing?
No, can't do that. This is all tied up. This is going to have to stay on the desk.
We can ask her. We can ask her to sit here, Deb, if that's easier. Can we ask her to just sit here while she moderates, and that way you can leave everything up?
Some of these are I can untie them and some of them I can't.
Well, why don't we just ask her to do that?
I cannot. So the best we can do.
Yeah, we'll just ask her to sit in this chair. That way she can sit.
Okay. People have wrenched these something fierce. And that'll give these folks a little more room if they don't have to crowd up there.
Yeah.
You think that'll work?
Yeah, it should be fine.
Okay.
She's really smart.
Who is it? The Australian.
She's really good. I took it because I wanted to do some in the clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know, I was looking really good.
Really known as a cancer people who are really
It is about that, man. It is about. Did you have class today? I hear you're coming from your reject. So the pool with the people that are gonna be so tight.
we were talking about this around this and they had that scene to go to the pool and we had it first was like that sounds awesome. It's like
So Danny's also gonna join us. Anyone else? Cat's coming, airport chat.
does that require her to like give up her something?
She can split her shower.
Okay.
But apparently their map says that you can get her into the airport. So she wants to do it.
Is that not done before?
Yeah. He was. Oh, that really. Big, big.
I just know that his official title on duty is Army.
Cool. So I'm not familiar with all the different branches, but being captain and navy. Essentially, in the army. Being a captain in the army or air force is like, I mean, you're an officer, but you're not very high up, so. I don't know how. You really was an officer.
Yeah, I don't know if I could get it. My kids are not on the transfer. You're so popular.
Was that all the people? Yeah. I heard that before the visitor. I don't remember what that is, or why it's from my hair, that's why. No.
Alright. So they might be running a few minutes late, so if you guys wanna go grab more food, feel free.
I'm gonna go tell Deb in the control room.
Yeah, I think that.
It's not good enough, right?
Yeah.
Mediterranean.
I don't know.
We got wrapped up in discussions of handling of classified information in military commissions and the UN.
That sounds pretty interesting. So, all right.
We weren't able to disconnect all this stuff because of presentations they're having later today. Are you guys sitting over there?
Yeah, I'll hide over here and they can have the
Okay.
shiny seats.
The other option is if you'd like to sit up there, you're welcome to.
I'll sit.
Yeah. It's kind of
I don't need to be perched. I'm
Right.
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure.
So, okay,
Got him, Mel and I, been primed and ready to go on most pressing
Good.
topics of
good. Excellent. That sounds really good.
military and UN practice. So.
Yeah, I think I discovered that they're also doing Baker-Bot's mock interviews at the
Oh,
same
okay.
time. So I think that will cut into our 1L accounts.
Yes.
So I think most of the 1Ls are probably doing that.
Doing mock interviews.
Yeah, but
Oh, that
yeah,
just sounds.
it is, it is what it is. It's always hard to compete.
Yeah, no, it's hard to pick the right
Yeah,
moment. So yeah.
but
Likewise, please.
so you flew in last night, Howie?
We flew in last night,
Excellent.
making the rounds to various professors
Great.
today.
Yeah, well, you also might be able to see a good number of your classmates since the big LAA BOV weekend.
Yeah, we've run into, we have 4 of our classmates are now faculty members. So
Oh, okay.
it's
Wow.
kind of interesting to see their names everywhere.
Which ones?
Sarah Powell,
Okay.
Rebecca Rich, Sarah Walker, and Coulter Lafer.
Yeah.
Oh, is Coulter here?
See him.
Oh, nice.
Doesn't he? Is he here all the time?
No.
I don't think
he's
he's,
like out
in,
in
he's in
Asheville.
Asheville, yeah.
Yeah.
He's got a shared office.
Right. That's what I thought.
He teaches a class, I think every spring, is that right? I don't know.
We'll have to see.
Yeah. Because he and Mike Gillis worked on that brief on Costa Rica and
That's right.
all of that. And I remember Mike like driving out to Asheville for.
Yeah, Mike is here.
Yeah, I know. I talked to him last night. It's so funny because Mike and I live like 4 blocks from each other in DC.
Oh, okay. So there you go. You just keep running into each other wherever you are.
Where do you live in DC?
Capitol Hill.
So nice. By Eastern Market somewhere?
North.
Okay.
So we're at 7 and I northeast.
That's nice.
Yeah, I like it.
When I was a kid, 15 years ago, I was in the city. It was a very different neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's been a very different neighborhood in my like 3-year tenure there.
Yeah.
Figure out where in DC would be ideal.
Oh yeah, I mean actually, Mike
Hill's supposed to be really
and, Mike
good.
and Kate live in Noma, the like just south of Florida there, Florida Ave there, and there are a ton of. They have a 1-year-old, or yeah, just almost 1 in December. Ton of like young families that are starting to stay because it's like just on the edge. Like it's still trying to afford to live there, like with like multiple bedrooms and multiple bathrooms. Like
Where exactly is that? Like,
it's pretty much it's northeast Capitol Hill, and it starts at like 2nd or 3rd around L or M. So it's
Just look for the strollers on the side.
yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the Brooklyn of
The park slope of Brooklyn, yeah.
and so it's nice that like there's new train stations and it's right there. And so it's definitely very livable, and like again, you can like have some amount of space.
which metro?
It's the Noma metro station on the Red Line.
Is that new?
It's newish within the last year or two.
Oh, yeah, that is new.
Yeah.
That's after my.
Yeah.
I used to live right there too. So.
When you have a chance.
Yeah.
So we'll get this up on the website. And then afterwards, if I can talk to you guys about setting up some separate interviews at some point.
You guys are rock stars.
Right, I kind of wanted to do separate video interviews today, but because of all the visitors, our media people are tapped out.
I know, I can just see them like frantically running
That's
around.
exactly what they're actually running.
15.
What's the event called?
Today's event, I'll
careers in national security law.
You know the,
That's like the only thing.
you know the, in 153 of the election. Thank you very much.
I know, I know, it's funny.
I'm gonna grab something to eat.
Yeah.
Well, we will go ahead and get started. I feel like you're all very far out there. I'm Gabriela McQuade. I'm a lecturing fellow here. I teach the Guantanamo Defense Clinic. Actually, both Wells Bennett and Howard Wachtel are clinic alumni from its early stages. And actually, they both got their JD/LLM from Duke in 2006. And before Duke, actually, both of them went to Georgetown. Mr. Bennett got his BA there. Mr. Wachtel went to the School of Foreign Service and also attended the London School of Economics. Wells Bennett is currently a fellow in national security law at the Brookings Institution in DC and is the managing editor of the Lawfare blog, which I'm sure all of you, insofar as you are slightly interested in national security, have looked at least once or twice. He does the blow-by-blow of the military commission proceedings. After law school, he clerked for Judge Terrence Boyle here in the Eastern District of North Carolina in Raleigh and was an associate at Arnold and Porter for a while. And while there, was also seconded to the Legal Aid Society for the District of Columbia before he joined up with Brookings and Lawfare. Mr. Wachtel is an advisor in the political section of the U.S. mission to the UN in New York, where he is on 2 Security Council subcommittees, one on al-Qaeda and Taliban individual sanctions and on counterterrorism. He was at Simpson-Bartlett in New York before that, and then joined the State Department as a Franklin Fellow in 2009. Has worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Royal Services Institute for Defense Studies, and is teaching at NYU's Center for Global Affairs this summer. Both of them have many more pieces of writing and accolades to their name, but I'll let them get started so we can focus on what they are most interested in and what you guys are most interested in. So maybe if I could start just to ask both of you to describe kind of what you do now and why what you do now was appealing to you.
I'll start. I work at the Brookings Institution, and I sort of wear 2 hats. I'm a fellow there in national security law, which means I do think tanky type stuff. I write papers and blog posts and go to what are called events when you have like a panel like this one and everybody has ice water. We discuss weighty issues of the day. That's sort of one slice of it, and the other one is running this website where I write also, which is kind of a little mix of being a quasi-editor for a publication, corralling law professors and people to do podcasts and write about stuff, keeping track of court cases that matter and events in the national security law world. There's a little bit of a kind of agency counsel component to it in that we negotiate. We have a relationship with the New Republic where we just sort of rolled out a little content feed arrangement where we supply their national security stuff on kind of an experimental basis. I'm kind of seeing where that's going to go, but talking to them about how that works and what that means for the management of the site. So it's sort of a omnibus law thing, but it's the only thing that's missing is really representing a client. But if I'm not writing my own stuff, which is all legally flavored, I'm doing something that bears on it, talking to the legal community, interviewing some people. I was just talking to Gabriela and Professor Morris, and we have a podcast series where we interview people. So we've, talk a lot to defense counsel on the prosecution in the 9/11 case, for example. We've had them on to talk about issues. Howie works with a lot of UN special rapporteurs, one of whom is a guy named Ben Emerson, who's just issued this interim report about drone strikes abroad and so on. And when he was doing his fact-finding in the U.S. side, we approached him, we'll have him on. And so in that capacity, I'm just sort of, it has a legal flavor to it, but I'm not really representing anyone, but it's all about the law and public policy, so we bring them on and talk to them. So how that kind of jives with where I was before. I mean, I haven't longstanding interest in national security law. I liked it when I clerked. I did the clinic when it was here, when it was, I mean, it was a clinic mostly in name. There was a bunch of people concerned about the events of the Bush years and the military commissions, and did a little bit of writing while I was in private practice and sort of stayed in touch with the people I wrote with. One of whom, just my boss at A&P and I, we wrote a book chapter on counterterrorism, and so the wrangler for the project was a Brookings fellow who later, just through sheer happenstance, when he was growing Lawfare, I wound up doing a little writing for the blog, and there was enough, basically at the stars kind of aligned to me to do a visiting fellowship there, and so I transitioned out of that, having done some international practice and some pro bono practice at A&P, but how that all kind of coheres, I'm not exactly sure, but it did. So I suppose if you were to sort of sum it up, it's just a long-standing interest in the subject matter and sort of kind of kept doing it, and then things kind of happened.
So I'm Howie. So I work right now on sanctions and counterterrorism issues at the U.S. mission to the UN. What does that mean? It basically means that anything that comes up in the Security Council that is kind of sanctions or counterterrorism related, we play some sort of role. We have a team of 4 people that looks at all of these issues. Everything from should we sanction X Al-Qaeda bad guy to should we reevaluate the sanctions regime against X country. So it's kind of broad-ranging or wide-ranging in some respects, but the day-to-day is it can be very specific at times. So I mean, basically, what I do is I guess I would divide my job into kind of 3 or 4 different categories. One is kind of to report on the day-to-day activities of the Security Council and the United Nations. So if there's a Security Council sanctions committee meeting dealing with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, I'll go to that meeting and sit in as the U.S. representative at that meeting, and then report back both to the ambassador at the U.S. mission and then also to Washington, to the State Department, to Treasury, and do that. So it's just kind of a basic reporting function. Another thing we do is if there's a need to negotiate a Security Council resolution or draft a Security Council resolution dealing with sanctions or counterterrorism, we'll put our heads together and work on that. We also kind of work on policy issues. We advise we advise the ambassador. We interact through the interagency process in Washington, trying to come up with ways to address certain sanctions questions. Again, should we sanction this country or this individual? Or certain counterterrorism questions. So should we, how can we help build X country's capacity to deal with this individual problem? There are rule of law questions. There are, more specific questions, kidnapping for ransom. There's kind of a wide scope of things we do on both sanctions and counterterrorism, but that's kind of the quick and dirty version. How I got here. I really liked Model UN when I was younger, and I really liked international relations and international law, and I tried to figure out a way to combine all of those things. And like Wells, I mean, it just sort of all came into place. You're in the right place in the right time, and you kind of keep pushing and an interesting confluence and end up where you are. But anyway, I mean, I think for both of us, we're in situations where we were hired because of our legal background, but we're not working in legal capacity. I don't work in a legal capacity for the U.S. mission, but I deal with interesting cutting-edge international legal issues on an everyday basis. In the sanctions world, that can mean what happens when an individual challenges the fact that he's on a sanctions list in a certain country. What does that mean for a country who's trying to implement sanctions against that individual? What happens if you have a conflict between what the European Court of Justice says and what you see in the United Nations Charter? So there are some interesting questions there in the sanctions world. And in the counterterrorism world, there are things like, how can we define terrorism? There's still no UN agreed definition of terrorism. How can we deal with a problem like kidnapping for ransom? Are there international legal tools at our disposal that we can use to deal with some of these challenges. So I think I was hired in my current position because of my legal background, because they wanted me to focus on the growing number of cases dealing with some of these sanctions and counterterrorism issues. But we have a separate legal team that deals with these on a day-to-day basis.
Talk about being hired for your legal background, but both of you started at larger firms in big cities, and how do you think that practice, that trajectory, does it influence the way that you do your job now, or what was that transition like from being actively representing someone to, as you both describe it, not working in a legal capacity right now?
I mean, I stayed on top of it when in private practice. I mean, I met some people who were in that world. My former boss is now an Obama administration official at the DNI, and so he was very plugged into it. So that's how I met people through, say, the ABA Standing Committee and stuff like that, just in terms of being around those sorts of people. I mean, that's a very Washington, D.C. kind of thing. A lot of, for good or ill, there's kind of a revolving door, and a lot of government officials tend to leave, and if they're lawyers, they tend to park it at a law firm, unless they want to retire. And so that, but also, I actually found it was very, very useful to write a ton, as much as I could, and that meant sometimes that means a little jockeying for position in a big law firm setting. So you have to be willing to do a lot of pro bono or a lot of business development things, or of your own, basically your own scribbling, which can actually wind up being on your own free time, essentially. But I found ways through those people to do some of those things, and they're some of the same people I now interact with on a sort of a much different way in the think tank world, whether it's talking to them about some proposed policy or legislation, or it's through the blog. You write a blog post about this or that court case involving Guantanamo or something involving drones or something, and then you get an email from them. They say, oh, I disagree with you on this point. You still interact with them. But having done all that, met them as people, and also done a little writing in that firm setting. I mean, I don't necessarily need to know everything about how to, really whip together a brief that would satisfy the DC Circuit's local rules right now. That's not something I would know how to do, and I'd have to, if I had to do that right now, I'd get someone else to do it, or I'd have to look it up myself and figure it out. But in terms of the substance, I still do the substance, and private practice gave me the opportunity to actually familiarize myself with that. I mean, that having been said, nobody really goes to a law firm. I did a mix of international arbitration, pro bono, and some sort of mixed bag national security stuff. But it was kind of catch as catch can. No one really goes to a law firm, and on your first day they say to you, we really need to know how you feel about the Military Commissions Act. I mean, that's not what happens. So it takes for me, the transition. I think something that I think you would want to be aware of is, that making a move in this space does imply a measure of having to really work within the context of a law firm to get opportunities to do these sorts of things. And that may not necessarily always mean what I'll call heartland law firm opportunities. So if you're in a private practice setting, there may be a big client and a big matter that you would be called on to work on, and that might imply like a very, very stable 5 years for you if it's a huge constellation of cases or something big that your firm wants to do a lot of. You can dedicate yourself to that. You can make that your way forward. But if you have this vision along the way, it's that you want to do something national security, the foreign policy world, unless that thing has a clear hook, and not all of them do, just because most law firms, big products liability cases or big cases involving environmental disasters, things like that, or financial services or something that's very important, and they may give you writing and other lawyer opportunities and things, but they may not be in that national security heartland. If that's the case, where you have a smaller practice group to do international national security stuff, you may have to kind of push yourself over there a little bit more to make the time for it, but it's worth doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a law firm experience is sort of whatever you make of it. I think for me, and some people have a very hard time at law firms, and other people embrace it and want to become partners. I mean, for me, I was a litigator for 3 years, a little over 3 years. I worked on some international arbitration issues, which I thought were the most interesting. I did some antitrust, some securities litigation, but it was really, it was a mixed bag. I think my writing definitely improved as a result of my experience at the law firm. My ability to review documents certainly improved as well. So I think it was useful, but by no means necessary if you want, a career in this sort of realm. At the same time, I mean, I think it's kind of whatever you make of it, and as you move on in your career, you'll make connections, you'll meet people, and you'll decide for yourself which experiences you think can help you moving forward.
I would also just add to that, there is, and I would be totally remiss if I didn't say, I sort of struggled with this when I was younger and I was at a law firm just coming off a clerkship. If you are using a law firm to service your debt or to pay down some things, your risk tolerance from a career standpoint, there's kind of an archetypal law student's approach, which is very conservative in its risk profile. And that's totally fine, particularly when if you're using a law firm to help you pay, to create opportunities for you later, that makes perfect sense. But my experience of this world, like that Howie and I sort of operate in, the kind of legally flavored but not necessarily doing law and implicating some aspect of national security or foreign policy, there are opportunities that maybe involve a slightly greater risk profile, a slightly greater tolerance for risk, and that's an individual decision. I'm not saying that anyone who wants to do this, I know some people who do national security jobs for the government or in the human rights world, whatever it is, who had a very sort of, I'm going into my firm, I'm doing 6 years in my firm. It does not really matter what I do that 6 years in. This is what I'm interested in. I will just get there. That's absolutely fine until they're completely in a financial and other way to just say I'm ready to start sending resumes out. That is actually makes total sense and is a very respectable and sensible path. That having been said, this world is so vague often and presents some unusual opportunities. I'm just thinking primarily of myself. I had talked about, I'd sent out some grant applications, and some of them basically, one of them just, some didn't happen. But along the way, I had an opportunity for basically kind of like a visiting transitional fellowship at Brookings before I became, a fellow. I actually don't really know what that means to be, but I was visiting and now I'm a fellow. But the visiting thing had a lot less formality to it and a lot less of a clear path than some other things that I'd looked at, just sort of apply for a government job, wait to hear back from them. And also, I wasn't exactly sure where that would lead. I think if you're willing to take a little bit more risk with what you're willing to do, Howie mentioned, things like, people have done the Franklin Fellowship. Another one of our classmates who did the JD LLM with us, he, very similar deal, just sort of has this interest and wanted to make a transition out from what he was doing. But the difficulty of the Franklin Fellowship is it's not paid. And so you have to make, your risk profile, your sort of arrangements all matter. Like if you have a family or you want to, if you're worried about debt service, maybe that's not going to work for you, or it shouldn't. But if you're in a position where you have more than one approach, if you're willing to do something like that, I think this world can be so vague and kind of out there that you can make connections and develop opportunities that you may not otherwise have known were there.
Just two quick things to add. Just getting back to law firms, I actually really enjoyed my law firm experience. I was at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett, and I had a wonderful time there. So I think regardless of whether it's kind of not the exact topic you want to be working on, it's not as much international law as you want. It's still important with any of these jobs to make sure you're kind of working in a good environment with smart people that you think will help you going forward. I think I got all of that in my law firm experience. On international jobs, it is, I think, easier to find jobs if you're willing to go out in the field, if you're willing to work abroad, because not everybody is willing to do that. If you're interested in international relations jobs, in Washington, in New York, well, that's where everybody wants to be. You're competing in the same pool as everyone else. If you are willing to go out in the field, there's a much smaller number of people who are interested in doing that. So that's kind of one tip that might be able to help you.
Both of you mentioned one of the benefits of your firm time being that it taught you to write and your writing skills. And so are there other skills that you think, whether the firm taught them to you or not, but other skills that you think are necessarily very much worth cultivating and focusing on so as to open more opportunity? Wells, write daily for all the world to see. So are there other similar things that you think are worth some concerted effort?
I sort of, not to beat a dead horse, but the willingness to try new stuff that maybe wouldn't necessarily correspond to an obvious career track. Some of the best lawyer experiences that I bring to bear on, if I write about stuff that goes in a courtroom, or I wrote a piece a few weeks back about this guy who was found abroad and believed to be involved in the embassy bombings a while back, and he was detained on a ship, and now he's being prosecuted in New York. The best courtroom feel I ever got was doing legal aid. And I really, it just seemed cool to me, so I figured I would do it. But it was like one of those things where we had a little rotation, and not everybody wanted to do it in my firm, and whether you did it, meant like an interruption in your workflow and all this stuff. And to me, it just sounded awesome as an opportunity. But an openness to try new things will serve you so well in this world. Again, and I don't mean that as any criticism of a more conventional approach to it, but keeping your eye out for stuff like that and take advantage of it when it comes along, because it will. I mean, there will be. I mean, if you're coming out of Duke Law and you're interested in this world, there will be those sorts of things.
And that.
Is there anything y'all want to know in particular?
Yeah, please. I mean, I have questions to direct. But
Oh,
if you,
excuse me.
No.
Don't let me see.
I was going to say I have questions, but I would much prefer that if there are questions that arise during
Yeah, if there's anything, please.
any stories that they tell or suggestions that they have that pique your interest, please feel free to raise your hand. We would like this to be a collaborative effort. Anybody currently? Yeah.
I have a question for Howard. So you mentioned you're not in a legal advisory role. What's your work product like? Because your job description is great and really interesting, but I struggle to conceptualize how the advice is actually delivered.
What do you do all day?
What do I do? It's classified. No, and I wasn't very articulate when I tried to explain it before. So, I mean, essentially, what do I do? I think about that question every day. A lot of what I do involves writing memos to, it was Ambassador Rice, now it's Ambassador Power. We have, let's say there's, we're going to be talking about Al-Qaeda sanctions in the Security Council on this date. So I'll be writing a memo to the ambassador saying, here's what's going to be discussed, here are the draft remarks I've been working on with Washington, here's how you're being prepared for this meeting. So it's a lot of correspondence with our front office. It's not only Ambassador Power, there are actually 5 ambassadors in the mission. I work primarily with Ambassador Power's 2 deputy ambassadors who cover different issues. So it's a lot of kind of just preparing your ambassadors for meetings. But I also sit in on a lot of meetings because the Security Council, everyone is familiar with the Security Council, but the Security Council has a number of subcommittees. There's a different Security Council subcommittee for each UN sanctions regime, and there's a different Security Council subcommittee for counterterrorism. There's this counterterrorism committee, and then there's a whole range of other counterterrorism entities that are associated with the UN. And obviously your ambassador can't attend every meeting, and so these are what they call expert level meetings, where I'll be the person that gets to sit in the chair with a placard that says United States in front of me, and in those situations I'll be working with Washington to come up with talking points and kind of represent the interests of the U.S. on whatever subject we happen to be discussing, sanctions, counterterrorism related. So part of what I'm doing is kind of keeping our ambassadors informed of what's going on, preparing them for meetings. Part of what I'm doing is sitting down and kind of serving as a diplomat. If you've done Model UN, that's what I do. And then the third aspect involves the nuts and bolts of preparing Security Council products. So helping to draft resolutions, whether they're in Security Council or the General Assembly, negotiating them and hoping for good results. So those are kind of but in terms of written products, memos to ambassadors, lengthy emails to Washington.
Do you still call them cables, or is that?
There are still cables. Yes, there are still cables, lots of emails, lots of notes to myself, and but yeah, I mean, there's no formal legal memoranda. I mean, I would write briefs at my law firm. I'm not writing briefs in this role at all. So it's actually very, very different. When I first started in this job, I was coming from a place where I'd be contributing to writing a 50-page brief on whatever issue, and I think one of my superiors within the first month came up to me as I was sitting in his office and just said, at some point I'm going to beat the lawyer out of you, because I didn't know how to write for this particular audience. I mean, writing a brief or writing an email to a partner is very different from writing to, a decision maker, someone who has, 2 minutes, if that, to look at something. They just want to know, here are the 3 things you need to know, and here's how it should be conveyed, or, this is the decision that needs to be made. I had to retrain myself and relearn how to write. So it's very different from what I'm doing before. And I'm sure, what you're doing now is probably vastly different from what you were doing in Arnold and Porter.
This also is going to be a duh kind of thing, so just forgive me, it is kind of duh. But if you have any opportunities to write right now, just do it. Because the national security and foreign policy community is not really different from the legal community in that it is shot through with people who believe themselves to be perfect and wonderfully capable communicators who are in fact imperfect and poor communicators, frankly, in written and spoken form. So if you can come out and write something, be it, differences of form are important, and there are partners at law firms who want to consume information in 5 pages with like memorandum on the top, or they want to have an email with bullet points in it, and they're in a policy setting, a decision maker want it one way, or if you write an article, it comes out another way. But the differences in form are learnable and quickly acquired through practice. You just used to be doing it this way, now you'll do it the other way. What is more difficult, takes time, and is absolutely invaluable is that if just you are good at clearly communicating stuff. That puts you, part of my work is, I interface some with the academy, and there are some people in the academy who struggle to communicate. Some of them are absolutely prodigious, but some of them don't. And the same is true with private practice. A lot of people in the bar are practicing at a high level, so they assume that they're that good at it. But the truth is they're really not. So if whatever it is you decide to do, be it foreign policy, national security, something else, if you have a lot of writing experience going in, you have a tremendous leg up.
Both of you, during law school, I mentioned that both of you were in the clinic, and I think how you were an extern at the Office of the Legal Advisor at the State Department. In addition to taking opportunities to write, are there other opportunities during law school that you think are important for people to take advantage of?
Clinics. Do clinics. Clinics, that's what that is. You get to go to court, you get to learn what law is. If anyone's briefing if anyone's participating or a professor is doing a court case, working with that person to come up with file a brief or something. I just I did as much of that stuff as I could, other than sort of like maxing out on like taking the same foreign policy labor law class like 3 times. That's basically what I'm doing. But I would. Yeah, as many of those clinical opportunities or collaborative experiential opportunities where you get to see how it's done, as much of that as humanly possible. Do the Gitmo Clinic.
We both studied in Geneva, which we loved. And yeah, I don't know. We both did the Guantanamo Clinic. We both studied abroad. I worked at the State Department, took a semester off and did that. I thought that was a useful experience. I would just say do something that interests you. Both of us, we just took a lot of classes that we thought were interesting. I took public international law probably 3 times in different, throughout my academic career because I was really interested in it. You're going to perform in a much more effective way if you're passionate about what you do, if you really enjoy what you do. And that's sort of goes without saying, but it doesn't matter if it's international law or something else. So I think the key is just taking classes and doing things that you think will interest you.
Anybody have any questions? No? Yeah?
Sir.
I have a question. So now you both seem to be in positions that you really enjoy and possibly could be sort of like the ideal job you would like to have. So at this point, looking forward, is it more of a sort of passive thought about if a career change comes up, I'll take it, or are you still trying to develop skills that may necessitate, future job change? And how active or passive do you think someone's role when they get to sort of their dream job should be?
I'll field this one. I have a really great job working for someone who's just awesome, and he was instrumental in bringing me to that place. And for me, there's kind of a larger question of what, and you get to this point when you're a few years out of school, particularly if you have a family or you're settled in a particular place. I mean, maybe you may be already, but if you're there, particularly in a kind of a mid-career after you are, or entering mid-career, I guess. I don't know. I'm making some assumptions about my life and career expectancy here, but when you reach that point, you could say, well, there's some other things I might like to try, and I won't take them off the table, or there's other things I really want to do. I'm in a setup where if I want to do something in the national law field generally, I can, and I sort of like, this is kind of, there's more than one next step that could be. It could be that, as a fellow at a think tank, I mean, you keep being a fellow at a think tank and sort of begin to behave more like a professional scholar and sort of commentator type person about law. So writing about law, just albeit not necessarily in the law review format and without the setup of a law school. That having been said, just speaking for myself, I tend not to think in terms of this job. And everyone's got their vision, their platonic vision of the ideal job. It's just perfect. And there are some jobs that I think of that like, wow, that would be awesome. And I I'd totally do that if that opportunity presented itself. And having that kind of like a couple of those ideas in mind, I try to keep my skills sharp, but they're more fundamental skills in this world. If you're talking about a real lateral career move, something where like, I've been doing policy for a long time, and it has a legal bent to it in the foreign policy or national security realm, but you have some curiosity about something else, I think that's totally different than this. If you're, again, myself, I could totally see myself, doing a think tank kind of track, but having done enough law to be, a lawyer, a plausible lawyer, and written about law enough in a policy setting. I can also have like a policy kind of, there is I talk to congressional staff pretty frequently about things in this subject matter area. So could I see myself doing that? Would I entertain that as a possibility? I'd think about it. But I tend to think it more in terms of like, I'm at a level where this is good and it's working, and if I can find something that does, in this space, I'll try and keep my knives sharp, stay writing, stay on top of events in this world. Like, I talked to a guy who was a Obama official, and he had stepped down and he had started working at a different organization, but something that does stuff along similar lines to Brookings and some other places in DC. And he had said that he was a detainee guy, and so he had done quite a bit on detainee affairs and policy at Guantanamo and places like Bagram Air Base and things like that. And he sort of said, well, he had, he's having a conversation with me kind of along the lines of the question you asked, and I was asking him pretty much the similar one. And he had said, I don't really know what my next frontier is in that regard. Like he was just at the end of the sort of detainee wave, so to speak, when people were figuring out a lot of sort of threshold questions about, which are still kind of getting ironed out, but way more sort of blue sky moment. He was the guy who knew a lot about how law of war detention worked as a practical matter, and he'd also been a lawyer and litigated a bunch of detainee cases. So from the standpoint of a guy whose dream job was to be at the Department of Defense working for the Obama administration, he was just totally current. And he's like, my wave is now gone. Like he's sort of like, the entire world is talking about like surveillance and stuff like that. And he's like, well, he's like, he's trying to, he's sort of happy where he is, but if he were thinking, I'd still like to maybe be a political appointee, or I'd still like to maybe work for this congressional committee or something, you might want to be thinking, sort of staying on top of more stuff, talking to more people. I mean, this is a long and meandering way of just saying, like, if you want to keep your options open, you should.
It's hard to top that.
You're going to have a hell of a time, I think.
Yeah. Actually. I'll just say a few quick things. you always want to be learning in your job. And so
That's an excellent point.
I'm 100% happy in my job, and this is exactly where I want to be. And I'm, trying something else is really scary to me because I'm very happy. I have, I work at a great place. I'm in one of those rare jobs. I'm from the New York area. I'm in one of those rare kind of foreign policy jobs where you can actually be in New York. And so the thought of trying something new is very, sort of terrifying. And I know that there's a possibility I can look back and be like, wow, that was the best job I ever had. At the same time, if you're not learning, and you reach a point where things get a little stagnant, I mean, it's sort of inevitable in any position where you want to move on and look for other things. I mean, I think the interesting question for both of us is kind of, we have a background in international law. We are lawyers. There are policy jobs out there, and there are legal jobs out there where we'd be working in a legal capacity. And I often find myself going back and forth. Would I prefer to be, acting in a legal capacity? Would I prefer to be, a legal advisor, at the State Department or elsewhere, or working on, more legal issues? Or is it better to be kind of on the policy side, where you're kind of looking at the interesting legal issues and helping to shape policy, but coming at it from a different angle? So I think that's, you always want to be learning. You're always kind of trying to find the right balance between policy and law, unless you're much more focused on, you want to be much more focused on the law. And what else?
Yes, one more thing that just occurs to me is in this world, as much as any other, particularly for lawyers, the odds of you doing one job or even two jobs for the bulk of your professional career are minimal in the extreme. And so once you've sort of got that out of the way, maybe you do have that platonic vision of a job. And if you get it, maybe you want to stay at it. But odds being what they are, it should be a comforting thing that, you may be moving. I don't mean that in any sort of like job insecurity way. I guess by way of example, the guy who brought me to Brookings, he's a senior fellow. He's actually not an attorney. But he's covered legal affairs, and he started at Legal Affairs covering. He was one of the first people to write extensively about FISA and the way FISA worked. This is back, in the Clinton years, like real long form pieces about, went to the court and stuff. And he also covered judicial nominations for a while, but then he was an editorial page editor at the Post. Again, he had a legal hook to it, but through the editorial page sort of perch was when he became acquainted with a lot of the national security issues that kind of rose to the fore in the Bush years. And that formed the basis for like longer form scholarly writing. But so then he lands at the think tank and kind of does the think tank thing, produces books and policy papers. But along the way, he has like a little bit of, he's in a conversation with some of his other friends, peers in this space who want to have a rigorous forum for discussing these issues. So they set up this blog, which begins like any other blog. But now, the reason I'm there is because he was a little more entrepreneurial about adding this sort of new media component to it that, involves, has a almost quasi-magazine-like operation. And when you look at that, there's sort of a journalism law thread going there, but like the business of being a line reporter on legal affairs versus being at the perch of a paper telling the world, the speak with one voice stuff that a newspaper does about like, we think, this law is unconstitutional or really bad, then going in longer form policy analysis, then going to the new media world. I think of him as having a sterling career, but it's sort of had its sort of unusual twists and turns. As a matter of fact, this is one thing, I've been on the receiving end of some career advice, which I think to be false, and I would encourage you to avoid, which is that when you, if you seek it out, particularly in the national security world, there is an unfortunate tendency by a lot of people who have reached what they view as a sort of self-satisfied place in their professional life, to look back at it and talk as if they sort of did everything as this sort of just a matter of volition. Like, oh, like one day I was just sort of sitting around and like the phone rang and they said, "Do you want to become Deputy General Counsel of the CIA?" And I said, "Sure." That kind of stuff. Avoid that at all costs.
Other questions?
Anybody else?
You were talking about the Warsame case, the man who was detained on the ship and is now being tried. And I think then, Howie, you were talking about getting to sit in these meetings where you are representing the United States. What do you think are the most, between detention in the middle of on the high seas and representing the United States, what's like the really fun stuff that you guys get to talk about and do? What are some of your best examples of when things say like, wow, I can't believe that, like,
Is it like what do we get to work on? We said that's
what
cool.
do you get to work on? What do you get to learn about?
All
What do you
right.
get to what universe do you get to operate in?
Well, I mean, like on a kind of a dorky level. I mean, like, some of the stuff that we get to do is we get to pore over some of the, at the center of the Snowden crisis is a bunch of very, in fact, technical documents which are being ignored by people, but the Snowden thing continues to proliferate. But actually having a handle on that story is actually kind of nice. I mean, I say that now, having a handle on it for certain discrete periods of time, just because the flood of information is so big. But that, or talking to people who really, I mean, you have to do it on kind of an offline, kind of informal basis, but talking to people who really are, for example, wondering about whether you need another AUMF for terrorism and whether that's a good idea or not. You have to do that on an offline basis, or what privacy would really mean if you're in a world where there's more mainstream and widespread use of drones in our airspace. Just being part of some of those conversations with some of the people who are thinking about those things and who those have been really fun for me. But I have it's a highly varied job. So like I don't want to make it sound like I'm at the forefront at the cutting edge. Some of you guys are like, if the president's on the line, like Wells, I think we need to bomb Syria. Or anything of that stuff. I'm not even close to it. But I guess the weedy aspects of the Snowden thing just acquaint you with a story that's very important in a way that's probably only dimly understood. And that's one part of what we do. The other part is periodically just interfacing with people about policy questions, which is fun. I mean, it's fun for people who are into it, which, I presume all of you are, else you wouldn't be here.
I mean, I think that like the coolness factor for me has evolved since I started. I mean, it's been over 4 years now. When I first started, I was in the Security Council in this like closed consultations room. And the first day I was there, I was sitting like behind this French deputy ambassador, and he turned around and sneezed on me.
That is cool.
So like, email my friends and say the French ambassador just sneezed on me in the Security Council. That's probably the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. But
Twitter message.
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's my handle. But I mean, there have been just so many interesting and rewarding experiences that I've been a part of the last few years. I mean, just working in the Security Council and a lot of this, I kind of take for granted now, but open up Microsoft Word and start typing out a Security Council resolution, and you're like, oh, I'm about to create some international law today. That's awesome. And it's, just sitting in on votes when resolutions are adopted and just like, being a part of negotiations. Just as the United States, you're obviously, as a permanent member of the Security Council, you're involved in a lot, but depending on what the issue is, different countries have, it's called having the pen, but, are responsible for drafting and moderating negotiations on certain topics. And so it just so happens that on counterterrorism issues, on like Al-Qaeda sanctions, Taliban sanctions, the U.S. has the pen, which means that we're kind of part of the process every step of the way, from the moment a resolution is drafted to the negotiation, everything, which is oftentimes it's enormously challenging just trying to bring 15 countries into the room and negotiate. But I mean it's unbelievable. I mean it's model UN, but actually the UN, and instead of without the model. I mean I talk to student groups frequently, and they say, what's the difference between this and model UN? And I think there's two big differences. One is when you're doing model UN, you don't have to deal with your capital. I mean, half the challenge if you work for one of these missions to the UN is trying to get decisions and policies from your capital. Dealing with Washington, negotiating with Washington is oftentimes just as challenging, if not more challenging, than dealing with your counterparts at the UN. And the other big thing is instead of receiving gavels and awards, you're actually just passing things.
The law is your
yeah,
reward.
Exactly.
Well, on that point too, it's been actually that I actually really enjoy is a lot of times in the blog public policy world, there can be kind of a wind tunnel kind of effect to it. You put out a lot of product. But the advantage of a blog format is that we like to hear from people, and it's not as if millions and millions of people read what me and a bunch of other people write, but this small community of national security lawyers does. So usually it's nice to, but if you write something like, gee, this is how I really feel about this one case, and then you get like an email back from someone who's like involved in like wrong, which happens all the time. It's nice, that you just said that's totally wrong. It's very humbling, but it's nice. The engagement is quite nice.
I have a question.
Sure.
This is about sort of developing a point of view, so it's a little bit of a meta question. But when you were litigators, your job was to represent whatever the point of view was of the client or the senior partner, the party line, so to speak. Now you're both in a position where, by definition, you have to develop a point of view, I'm assuming, and represent that point in a way that makes sense to policymakers, not just other lawyers. What was that process like? Was that difficult, or did it came to you organically, or maybe it's still coming along? What are your thoughts on that?
In my own life, there actually hasn't been much of a change, because a lot of the stuff, the interests I had and my personal views about it, very rarely conflicted with anything I did in private practice, because they were usually the practice stuff was very disparate from it. I did a ton of pro bono, but I was interested in national security law. There's some stuff in public international law where, maybe, there's a party line component to it, but there wasn't much of a change. And I won't put words in Howie's mouth, but Howie believes every word of U.S. foreign policy ever written that's ever been said since the dawn of time, because he works at the Department of State. But yeah, oddly enough, the thing that's a little bit more daunting about being in the think tank world is your value add is supposed to be your own perspective. And a lot of times you're like, gee, man, I don't know what I think. And having to formulate it, it's not so much that I just sort of find a way to convert one to the other. It's just that, and I felt sort of constrained in that role as a lawyer. It was more that on some issues I just knew what I thought and I think, and now I'm a little bit more free to air them than I would be sort of, if you're in public, for example, if you have client relationships at firms, there are a lot of reasons besides your representation that might mean that you shouldn't speak publicly about something. But as far as some of the policy stuff goes, it's not so much that I changed there. It's that now that's supposed to be what I do now. And there are some days that I'm like, oh my goodness, now I have to have an opinion. I have to say, oh dear,
Yeah, a lot of what I'm saying in public will have to be fully cleared by Washington, and so if we have remarks in a public setting, whether it's the Security Council or in a committee meeting, sometimes you have a little bit of latitude, and there's room for freelancing and not really personal views, but what you think your colleagues think in Washington. But for the most part, a lot of it tends to be scripted, but because we get to feed into that process, there's rarely an occasion where I'm saying something that I completely disagree with. There's never an occasion where I'm saying something that I completely disagree with. And by the way, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of State.
I don't know how extensively you deal with people from other countries on a day-to-day basis, but I was curious if you do, how you address maybe different cultural or different government approaches in defining national security, or how they might deal with the same kinds of issues that the U.S. faces.
That is such a Howie question.
Every day, and it's one of the best things about my job. Interacting with foreign counterparts is great. I wouldn't say it's differing perceptions of national security. I think it's your foreign counterparts have different styles, they have different priorities. Their ambassadors will care about different issues. Their capitals operate differently. So it's just trying to, and their personalities are very different. So sometimes it can be difficult to kind of get a feel for each person you work with. But it takes a while is kind of the short answer. But it really is interesting because a lot of missions will tend to kind of send the best of the best. Working for the UN is a cushy and important post. That's not always the case. Sometimes you have missions where there's only a few people and maybe they're good, but they're working on 15,000 different issues and they don't have time to focus on some of the more specific questions that arise in committees. So yeah, that's not really answering your question, but it's fun dealing with foreign counterparts, and it really is interesting to kind of see what their different priorities are, what issues they focus on, and then try to figure out ways to interact with them. But it is incredible that, I mean, everyone speaks English in New York at the UN. You have to. I mean, we negotiate in English. In Security Council meetings, there are 6 official languages, but you have to speak English. But I mean, most of the people I work with who are not from the U.S. mission speak at least 3 or 4 languages, which is pretty incredible. And this is when we were in Geneva together. I think we were at a Pizza Hut. But in Geneva, everyone speaks English, French, and German. And one of the waiters came over to me and said, if you speak 3 languages, you're trilingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. If you speak 1 language, you're American.
Questions? Following up with Zishang's question about how you interact, what are generally some other things you struggle with or hurdles, like things that make your job more complicated aside from all of the fun stuff you get to do? What are the things that make your job difficult? And
trying to do a bunch of stuff at the same time. I'm not by temperament or habit a multitasker. As a matter of fact, I've adapted to that as a concept. Just when I was first learned what it meant, I thought it basically meant half-assing more than one thing. So my job is sort of multifaceted, and if it weren't for the blog and the things that surround it, I would have more of a kind of a traditional public policy or like professorish kind of format, but I don't. So I have to keep track of what is going on in the world. We have some people will come and do guest posts for us and write in, and they may say, I saw something that was there and I disagree with it, and I'd like to publicly disagree with it. And maybe if you want to run it, and I'll say, well, if it seems like a good point, you say fine, but then maybe you want to make sure that edit a little bit of what they say or like get it down to the right size. Doing that while also keeping my mind around like my own writing projects and remembering that we have to put something up on Sunday to run a podcast, and just sort of making sure that the person who's doing that gets there at the right time. There is, that's just sort of plague of modern work kind of thing. I remember like I done some of my best work when I have exactly one thing to do and a lot of time to do it, and I'm like, oh, that's good, instead of this feeling of triage. But I think that's pretty common. Just about, certainly that'll be common to you in your legal practice, whatever kind of law job you wind up doing. But yeah, the triage can be tough.
For me, it's I'm dealing with 2 notoriously slow-moving bureaucracies: the U.S. government and the United Nations, and so trying to get answers out of Washington or trying to get things done at the UN are often very difficult things to do. So it's interesting to see how each bureaucracy operates, and there are some pros and cons in each, but. That's unique to this job, working for the U.S. mission to the UN. But then there are typical problems that I think when we graduated law school, we were probably like one of the first people subject to this, and we're still getting 250 emails a day is absurd, and you don't have time to reflect and to think about things. I was telling Wells last night. I finally understood, like, not that I question the importance of think tanks, but you really understand the importance of think tanks and academics, because if you're if you're a bureaucrat, if you're a diplomat, you really don't have time to think about these things. You rely.
Are you saying I've changed your life for the better?
I will go on lawfareblog.com and be like, oh, that's something I hadn't thought of before. Let's try to apply that. Thank you, Wells Bennett. But truly, it's. I think the whole BlackBerry generation is. This is still a work in progress. But that I think is my biggest challenge. Dealing with these 2 huge bureaucracies, and then on a day-to-day basis, just figuring out how to prioritize and deal with this massive amount of information that I receive every day.
Any questions? I think Lila's to send us off on a more optimistic note, maybe, is for each of you, with the topics that you're covering, what do you recommend? What do you think is the thing to watch in your relevant field right now? What do you think is the next big thing, or the thing that's percolating that everybody should be
Ocean drones.
paying attention to?
I would probably, big data and cyber, if you know how that stuff works, at a more fundamental level, you're very well situated. And beyond that, issues surrounding surveillance. But yeah, I mean, the universe of people who have a grasp on the relevant law and who also can think seriously about big data or about offensive and defensive cyber stuff. There's not many of them, but yeah, it's no secret. I mean, it's not sort of the next wave. It's the wave that's here and won't break. You know what I mean? So I would say those.
I mean, we were talking about this before, but how many of you have heard of something called the Kadi case before the European Court of Justice? Does that ring a bell? Google it. KADI or QADI. It goes both ways. Doesn't matter. I think this is kind of right in the middle of everything I'm doing right now and concerns all UN sanctions regimes. You've got these sanctioned individuals who are challenging member states' ability to implement UN sanctions against them because they're saying it's a violation of their fundamental rights. So what happens when you have a conflict between what the European Court of Justice says and what the UN Charter says? Because member states have a Chapter 7 legally binding obligation to implement UN sanctions. So when the two collide, what happens? And this is not something that's just unique to Europe. I mean, there I think will be more court cases in the US and other countries where you're going to have these collision of interests. And I mean, imagine, for example, it's not hard to imagine a US court saying, well, actually, this person on this sanctions list, his rights were violated when we put him there. And even though it's a UN obligation to implement the sanctions, we can no longer do so. Well, we're going to listen to the U.S. court. But what does that mean? Because we would be out of compliance with our Chapter 7 obligation. So therefore, we'd be, not acting in accordance with the UN Charter. I mean, these are the sorts of issues that I think that are arising throughout the world, primarily in Europe. And it's affecting UN sanctions now, but it's about to affect, I think, a lot of other areas. So this has been going on for about 7 years, and it's, I think, going to come to a head soon.
Well, thank you all for having us.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Great.